So how many of you are familiar with James Luther Adams? I can't actually see if anybody's raising their hand, so I'm going to assume that some of you are familiar and some of you are not. And I just want to give you a little bit of information and background about who he is before I launch into the reading here. James Luther Adams was a Unitarian minister who served our denomination for many, many years. He was active in Germany during the rise of Hitler, and in fact was part of the resistance there before he came back to the United States. He then took that learning and shared that with people here and wrote extensively on his experience and how he felt, what he felt were the best ways to support democracy. So this reading comes from a UUA Leader resource, and I will begin. During his so-named conversion experience in Germany, Adams said that he gained the conviction that a decisive institution of the viable democratic society is the voluntary association. Adams characterized his experiences in Nazi Germany as inducing a kind of conversion in him that brought about his plunge into a host of civic-minded, voluntary associational activities when he returned to the United States. He claimed that such associations are a medium for the assumption of civic responsibility. Adams further argued a religious congregation is a voluntary association that attends to the psychological well-being of its members, as well as to the organization and direction of their collective behavior for promoting social, political, and economic change in the wider world. For Adams, voluntary associations are organizations to which we have freely chosen to belong, rather than those into which we were born, such as birth, family, community, and political state. Adams insisted that it is in voluntary associations that we gain the power to negotiate our own internal feelings with others, and also gain power as a group to negotiate our non-voluntary associations that rule our lives. Religious voluntary associations work in both the private psychological sphere of the individual and also with the individual as an utterly associational being, someone who is known by their group affiliations. And this is why Adams says, "By their groups you shall know them." Adams concludes that we learn how to negotiate the tensions between our inner lives and external behavior together in voluntary associations. So that's the end of the reading. I just want to give you all a minute to kind of absorb that. So I assume you all know that we had an election recently, and that election did not go as well as some of us would have hoped. There is now a concern, as there was before, about the integrity and the strength of our democracy. So today I want to just talk a little bit about how we might make some deeper changes to support our broader democracy and to actually create opportunities to sustain it and strengthen it. So I spent a lot of time in my life working in organizing, and I've come across a lot of models for social change. And models like to think about how we shift the culture from the world as it is, how we experience it, to the world as it should be. And just a quick little caveat, if you think about the conversation you were having this morning about the dogs on the island, the question about should dogs be on a leash or should dogs not be on a leash are a question about the world as it should be, right? Like, how do we see the world as it should be? And this tension between the world as it should be and the world as it is the constant seed of the ideological struggle of our society and our political parties. And so to sort of expand that just a little bit, just take a look at Project 2025 to see the stark differences in how we see the world as it should be. From the more progressive end of things, we see the world as it should be as a world that cares for as many people as possible. It recognizes our interdependence and our interconnection and invites us to be part of the process for change. In the language of this faith, It's a world where people seek to place love at the center. And in our congregations, this is the kind of world that we imagine and we try to create as best we can. But the question really comes in, how do we actually make that happen? And I think you all there in Martha's Vineyard might actually have a little bit of a leg up from the rest of us. And I'll say why as we get a little bit long here. But I've been working in organizing for more than 30 years, and I've learned a model working with the Industrial Areas Foundation that stuck with me for many years. And this model, if you will imagine, is a Venn diagram of 3 overlapping circles. So you have one circle that is the civic sphere, you have one circle that is the government sphere, and you have one circle that is the market sphere. Sorry, I'm not sure how to shut those off. So you have these 3 spheres that are sort of operating together as like a 3-legged stool. So when they're in balance, everything works great. But when they're not in balance, you have a problem. So the civic sphere is the voluntary institutions that James Luther Adams wrote about and talked about. These are groups that are voluntary. Unions, clubs, churches, low competition teams, other kinds of voluntary groups that we might join. My parents, when I was growing up, were part of a bridge club. They danced with a Scottish dancing group. So there's lots of ways in which those kinds of organizations bring us together in social environments. They're places where people can connect and have conversation that include their values, and relationship has priority. So the civic sphere is really about our relationships and how we connect with one another in those relationships. And Adams insisted that it's in these voluntary associations that we gain the power to negotiate our own internal feelings with others, right? And also to negotiate with other institutions that rule our lives. So it's here in these organizations that we check our own interests and impulses, and we negotiate changes to government with others by our connections in this relational sphere. The second sphere is the government sphere. And this is the visible part of our democracy. It's elected officials, policy making, law crafting, shaping our culture, and legal and policy-based decisions. And of course, all 3 of our branches of government fit into that sphere, all the way down from our local government up through our national government. And government is there to support the people in the society in which people live, right? The pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. And this sphere is responsible for regulation of the corporate and market forces, but also of individuals. So it's the way in which we kind of mediate and support our lives. And it's government's job to mediate the transactional impulse of the market sphere and the relational impulse of the civic sphere. And this sphere is most effective when people can influence outcomes for the greater good through elections, which leads to the balancing of corporate and community needs. And the government supports workers in an effort to maintain some semblance of fairness, including unions. And then we have the third sphere. And this sphere, the market sphere, is originally designed to create goods and services necessary to support civil society. And that includes innovation, and it includes employment. So the market is made up of corporations, and these corporations are also designed to make a profit. The impact on the civic sphere exists as both markets, as I said, as market serves both as employers and as makers of products and services intended for that same civic sphere. And in American capitalism, they are designed to make a profit at all costs. In fact, CEOs and boards can be sued by shareholders for not making a profit, which means that the market has to externalize as much as possible in the way of costs and maximize profits as much as possible, no matter the costs. The market sphere is transactional. It's all business. So those are the 3 spheres. If they're in balance, everything's great. Things work out well, people are happy. And in fact, during the 1960s, we had something called the social contract, which was an agreement between auto workers and the owners of the automakers, that led to a significant stabilization of and prosperity for the white middle class. But then in the 1980s, these spheres begin to shift. The government sphere comes under attack first, quickly followed by a decline in the civic sphere. Ronald Reagan and his administration famously said, "Government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem." And they imagined a world as it should be, very differently from the world that we generally imagine. They dramatically cut taxes that funded government and slashed budgets, including federal assistance to states, by 60%. They sought to dismantle the Department of Education. They fired government workers and began a process of deregulation that has led to record profits in the markets and a devastating decline in civic society. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration undermined unions with the greatest success since the 1930s. They fired all of the air traffic controllers, workers who were striking because they were concerned about working too many hours given the stress and strain of the high-pressure job. It signaled the end of government support for the worker and unions have declined for decades. The good news is, in the last 4 years, we've seen a bit of a rebound in unions, and that power of the workers, of that civic element of society, has begun to push back against the market. Challenges to environmental laws, criminal codes, tax codes, and anything that might impinge on market expansion have been mounted and have succeeded over the last 4 decades as the market sphere has grown. And these changes in government occurred, market sphere is also impacting and influencing family and civic life in slow and insidious ways. If any of you lived through the 1980s, and I expect many of you did, you saw record mergers and acquisitions as businesses sought to minimize and externalize those costs, thereby increasing profit for a small few. And those mergers led to huge layoffs, and people did what was necessary to provide for their families. More hours of work meant less time for family and outside activities, and it also meant being more exhausted when time was available. Education reforms begun under Reagan and Bush externalized activities that were once core to public education: music, art, phys ed. The policies cut and starved public schools, and some continue to use this starvation-induced decline to justify support for school vouchers. This externalization means more family and personal time has to be used for transporting children to and from these activities, at least for those who can afford it. I gotta say, the idea of applying market concepts to government is the antithesis of what government is supposed to do. When government uses the business model of externalization to cut costs, someone has to pay those costs. And it's always, always those who can least afford it. And it's about to get even more imbalanced. And all of this leaves less capacity to engage and participate in the matters that influence our lives, less times to even begin to imagine the world as it should be or could be. And our human response to all of this is mostly frustration, fear, anxiety, depression, and helplessness. The civic sphere, now controlled by the power of the market, is kept busy, panicked, and anxious, unable to do anything because there's no energy. And the government sphere, now controlled by the market sphere, has corporate lobbyists and right-wing organizations like ALEC and the Heritage Foundation directing policy and law at both the state and national levels. And I just want to say, when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came into the House, one of the things that she said, she was surprised that her orientation to government, to the House of Representatives, was led by the lobbyists. We know the current administration will pursue Project 2025, and we know that people will be harmed by this. And we can resist this. We can focus locally and strengthen the power of the civic sphere. By strengthening that civic sphere, we strengthen the underlying foundation of our democracy with engagement. And that engagement strengthens the power of government to push the market back to its right size, forcing the market to be responsible for its costs, which fundamentally impacts their profits. There was a surge in voluntary organizations as the previous administration came to power the first time. Groups like BLM, Surge, and other types of transparently political organizations came out of the awareness that we needed to work together or we weren't going to get anything done at all. The quiet quitting that happened over the past few years was also a reset, a way of informing the market and corporate forces that there's actually a limit to what we in the civic sphere will tolerate. And the voluntary organizations that we belong to are essential for our health and well-being. Research shows us that it's our connection that keeps us healthy, that makes us happy, that allows us to thrive. It reduces anxiety and depression and allows us an opportunity to find meaning and to understand better how to engage with one another. Post-lockdown, and I would argue we're still sort of post-lockdown, many of us are still looking for ways to connect and to belong, to be together in communities of compassion and learning and care. And I heard you say during one of the candles that you had a meeting yesterday or sometime this week where you gathered together to talk about the things that you're grateful for. These are the kinds of opportunities that Adams was talking about. How do we engage with one another? How do we have conversation? How do we move beyond the polarization that's happening in our society to find ways to compromise and to collaborate for the future that we all want to see? To be very clear, the threat to democracy isn't over. And we've been in a similar place before, and democracy has prevailed. And right now, I see the strengthening of that civic sphere as vital if we're to keep these forces at bay. I want to just remind you all that 15 million people didn't vote this time, that voted last time. There's a lot of room here. There's a lot of opportunity for us to engage people, to engage conversations, to find out where our compromise and collaboration can lead us. Voluntary organizations are the place we learn to talk to each other, to listen to each other, to engage our empathy and compassion, and to have empathy and compassion expressed to us. We share those deepest values for our children and our grandchildren when we're in those more relaxed relational places, and we can talk about what our deepest values are and what is actually happening, the impact on ourselves and our families. We learn to mediate and moderate for the sake of community. We learn to suppress our own personal needs and desires for the good of the community. Participation in voluntary organizations requires time to be part of them. And our current society has been atomized to the point where we can't connect. It's hard to connect. We've forgotten. And so it's important to reconnect with our neighbors and friends. And again, I know you live in an island, and so your setting is a little bit different. Your community in some ways is tighter and smaller. But I'm sure that there are places in which there are differences, and some of those differences are significant. Groups like Braver Angels, community conversations, difficult conversation circles, even things like sewing groups, sporting activities, clubs, card games, all of these create opportunities for us to talk about our differences and to listen to one another. But we can only do that if we have curiosity. We can only do that if we're open to change. We can only do that if we're willing to listen to one another. And I just want to say one thing about that. I want to be really clear that as we create opportunities for tolerance, we can't tolerate the intolerant. So that's a place where we just can't have room, because if the intolerant is allowed to have space in a tolerant area, that intolerance will take over. So it's really important for us to continue to move and to push through our progressive values of pluralism to understand and to help other people understand us. In his writings, James Luther Adams is saying that we can only imagine the world as it should be in community, in dialogue with others. I can imagine the world as it should be, but my world as it should be may be different from yours. If we can engage in conversation together, we can create maybe even something better than what each of us can create alone. Being willing to be appropriately vulnerable as a community and open to change is what allows that kind of vision to be enacted, allows us to engage with one another and to bring that world into being through compromise, collaboration, and collective care. Now, some of you may come to church, to congregational life for purely social reasons, but know that being part of this congregation, you're doing more than that. By being part of this congregation, you cast your lot with people who believe in progressive liberal values: justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity, all of which hold love at the center. And as you have conversations about dogs on leash or not on leash, how do we find compromise? How do we find opportunities for us to bring together the community needs and to set aside our own personal desires in ways that actually do support the greater good? This is a small example, but it's a really important way of understanding how we can work together to create the world we dream about. My colleague, Reverend Soto, writes, remember that patience doesn't require all the answers up front, only one. Fortunately for all of us, we have one response: to remain together through awkward times and happy ones. We remember and we find our resolve in one another. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.